In the dimly lit headquarters of occupied France, German officers pored over maps of the Channel coast. It was 1943, and whispers of an eventual Allied invasion were everywhere. Yet within the Wehrmacht's ranks, one assumption remained constant. American artillery posed no serious threat. German commanders, hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, scoffed at the notion that U.S. gunners could rival their veteran batteries. To them, the Americans were mechanically reliant, soldiers who leaned on machines instead of instinct, who lacked the discipline of German field artillerymen trained since the First World War. Diaries from German officers mocked the green army that depended on factory-made firepower rather than battlefield cunning. Their gunners are slow, uncreative, and predictable, one officer paraphrased in his journal. Propaganda reinforced the sneer, depicting American forces as amateurs whose shells were plentiful but ineffective. In the tradition of the Wehrmacht, artillery had always been respected, but maneuver warfare, blitzkrieg, speed, and surprise was the true hammer of victory. Veterans who had raced across Poland, France, and the vast plains of Russia trusted in their ability to outfight any opponent. The Americans, they believed, could never master the fluid dance of combined arms. Yet across the Channel, a different reality was taking shape. Britain's skies filled with transports delivering men, guns, and mountains of supplies. American factories roared with life, their assembly lines producing not only tanks and jeeps, but the tools of modern firepower. The M2, a 105mm howitzer, the M1 155mm long tom, and endless streams of ammunition. Railcars carried crates of shells to ports in southern England, where they stacked like miniature mountains. Inside those factories, women riveters, machinists, and laborers worked 12-hour shifts to arm the gunners who would soon prove themselves. Engineers refined fire control tables and experimented with new technologies, including proximity fuses that could detonate shells in midair with lethal precision. To the Germans, these innovations were invisible, but to the Allies, they were game-changing. Still, in late 1943 and early 1944, German overconfidence reigned. After all, their batteries had pounded Soviet armies into submission and held back British offensives in North Africa. They had learned to trust their hardened divisions and deeply dug fortifications. Even as intelligence reports warned of Allied artillery strength, many commanders dismissed them. "The Americans will drown us in shells," one officer was overheard saying. "But their fire will lack direction. We will endure as always." This chapter's story builds to the moment of irony. While German officers spoke with derision in their command posts, American soldiers across the Channel were drilling relentlessly. Gunners rehearsed loading, sighting, and firing until their actions were second nature. Supply chains were streamlined, communications refined, and doctrine rewritten to prioritize speed and coordination. Unlike the lumbering force the Germans imagined, the U.S. Army was preparing an artillery arm capable of unleashing storms of steel with accuracy and power. The stage was set. German commanders believed themselves shielded by experience, training, and fortified walls along the Atlantic coast. But just beyond their reach, an arsenal unlike any the world had seen was taking form. The laughter of overconfidence would soon be silenced by the thunder of American guns. The scorn of German officers echoed across Europe, but on the other side of the Atlantic, a very different rhythm pounded. The clang of steel, the roar of furnaces, and the relentless hum of assembly lines. America, awakened by war, was transforming its vast industrial might into the most formidable artillery machine the world had ever seen. In Detroit, where cars once rolled from the lines of Ford and Chrysler, workers now built the backbone of U.S. firepower, the M2, a 105mm howitzer. It was a compact, reliable gun, light enough to be towed by trucks, yet powerful enough to deliver devastating barrages. In Pittsburgh and Chicago, steel plants poured the barrels for the M1 155mm long tom, a weapon whose range and accuracy earned it a fearsome reputation. By 1944, these guns were being churned out by the thousands, each one a symbol of America's ability to convert industrial muscle into battlefield dominance. Factories became battlefronts of their own. Women riveters and machinists, many of them working such jobs for the first time, took their place beside skilled engineers. Posters of Rosie the Riveter urged them forward, while government contracts demanded speed beyond precedent. 12-hour shifts were common. Exhausted workers left their stations only to be replaced by another shift, ensuring the lines never stopped. "We knew every bolt meant another soldier had a better chance," one factory worker later recalled. The scale was staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 250,000 artillery pieces and tens of millions of shells. Roosevelt's government poured resources into research, refining fire control systems and logistics to ensure that American gunners could not only fire faster, but also hit with remarkable precision. In laboratories, engineers perfected the proximity fuse, a technological leap that allowed shells to explode near their target, turning barrages into near walls of fire against aircraft and infantry alike. Mobility was another American innovation. Unlike traditional European armies that relied heavily on horse-drawn artillery, the U.S. military ensured its guns were truck-towed or mounted for rapid deployment. This gave American gunners flexibility, allowing them to reposition and concentrate firepower wherever it was needed. On the future battlefields of Europe, this mobility would prove decisive, enabling U.S. divisions to mass fire in minutes, a feat the Germans had believed impossible. Behind the scenes, logistics became a science. The Army Service Forces designed supply chains that stretched from American factories to ports in Britain, where millions of shells were stockpiled in preparation for the invasion. Each shell was carefully labeled, crated, and tracked. By the spring of 1944, Allied depots in southern England held so much ammunition that locals described entire hillsides transformed into forests of crates. The confidence of American gunners grew with every shipment. Training grounds across the U.S. echoed with the thunder of practice barrages. Soldiers learned to coordinate fire missions, perfecting techniques like time on target, where shells from multiple batteries were calculated to land simultaneously on enemy positions. What had once been dismissed as mechanical reliance was now a deadly choreography of mathematics, precision, and overwhelming volume. German intelligence had some awareness of this growing arsenal, but few believed it could rival the experience of Wehrmacht batteries. The irony was striking. What German commanders mocked as clumsy and excessive was, in truth, becoming an unstoppable storm. As 1944 approached, America's arsenal of democracy was no longer a promise. It was a reality. Guns, shells, trucks, and trained gunners stood ready to unleash destruction on a scale unseen in history. Across the Channel, German officers still clung to their disdain, unaware that soon their fortifications and their armies would tremble under the weight of America's firepower. The laughter had faded into warning whispers. The arsenal was ready, and the storm was coming. The arsenal forged in American factories did not roll directly onto the beaches of Normandy. Its first real test came in the deserts of North Africa, where green American troops faced the hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht and Afrika Korps. The clash would be brutal, humiliating at first, but ultimately transformative. In February 1943, at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, U.S. forces suffered a stinging defeat. German panzers, led by Erwin Rommel, punched through inexperienced American lines. Amidst the chaos, artillery units struggled. Crews fumbled with fire control tables, batteries lacked coordination, and shells often fell wide of their marks. German officers watching the engagement mocked the inaccuracy of American fire, noting how barrages often lagged behind fast-moving tanks. "They shoot much, but little lands where it should," one German observer paraphrased in his report. But even in failure, lessons were being absorbed. Survivors recalled how, in desperate moments, concentrated barrages slowed German armor and bought precious time. American commanders quickly recognized artillery's potential. Training was overhauled, communications streamlined, and tactics refined. Within months, the same units that had faltered began to master mass firepower. The change was evident by mid-1943 during the Sicilian campaign. As American and British forces advanced inland, German and Italian defenders relied on fortified positions in the island's rugged hills. Here, U.S. artillery came into its own. Batteries of 105mm howitzers, supported by heavier 155mm long toms, unleashed sustained barrages that cracked bunkers and shattered counterattacks before they could form. The soundscape of Sicily was relentless, the whine of shells overhead, the earth-rattling detonations echoing through valleys, and the acrid smoke that hung in the air long after the guns had fallen silent. Eyewitness accounts spoke to the shift. American infantrymen, once wary of their own artillery's effectiveness, gained confidence. When the barrage started, one soldier recalled, "You felt like the mountain itself was fighting for you." On the German side, diaries noted frustration and disbelief at the accuracy and persistence of American fire. Positions that had held against earlier attacks were reduced to rubble after hours of methodical shelling. The baptism continued into Italy's brutal campaign, where terrain favored defense. At Monte Cassino in early 1944, the historic abbey became a stronghold for German paratroopers. For days, American and Allied artillery pounded the heights, delivering one of the most intense bombardments of the war in Europe. Entire hillsides were scarred, villages flattened, and defenders forced into deeper fortifications. Though the abbey itself was famously destroyed by aerial bombs, the role of artillery in the surrounding battles was decisive. Barrages neutralized counterattacks, disrupted supply lines, and slowly eroded German strength. It was here that American artillery earned its title as the King of Battle. No longer hesitant, gunners coordinated with infantry and armor in seamless operations. Fire missions were timed with precision. Creeping barges rolled forward just ahead of advancing troops, while time-on-target salvos struck with devastating simultaneity. German commanders who had once mocked U.S. gunnery began to admit its growing effectiveness. By the time the Italian campaign dragged toward Rome, the transformation was complete. U.S. artillery was no longer a blunt instrument. It was a finely tuned weapon of war. Soldiers who had once endured humiliation at Kasserine now marched with the confidence that their guns could break any obstacle. The baptism of fire in North Africa and Italy forged not just weapons, but the men who wielded them. The lessons of the desert and the mountains would be carried across the Channel, where the guns of America would be called upon for their greatest test, the Storm of Normandy. By the spring of 1944, the green hills of southern England had become an armed camp. Villages were overrun with soldiers, fields were lined with vehicles, and warehouses brimmed with munitions. At the heart of this buildup lay a staggering logistical challenge: preparing the artillery that would hammer open the gates of Fortress Europe. Operation Neptune, the assault phase of the D-Day landings, required a symphony of firepower. Naval guns from battleships and cruisers would pound coastal defenses, while American and British field artillery would come ashore with the infantry to establish beachheads. Millions of shells had to be produced, transported, and stockpiled. The numbers were mind-bending. By June 1944, Allied depots in Britain contained over 3 million rounds of 105 mm and 155 mm ammunition, stacked in neat pyramids that sprawled across the countryside. Locals described entire landscapes swallowed by crates of high explosives, guarded day and night by military police. Behind the numbers stood men and women who made it possible. Artillery battalions trained incessantly in the English countryside, their howitzers thundering as gunners rehearsed fire missions. Crews practiced landing drills, learning how to haul their heavy weapons off landing craft and into position under fire. Each movement was timed, refined, and repeated until muscle memory took over. Fire control teams drilled on rapid calculations, refining the time-on-target technique that allowed hundreds of shells from scattered batteries to strike simultaneously. The goal was ruthless efficiency, to bring the full weight of American firepower onto German defenses within minutes of landing. At the same time, Allied scientists worked to perfect battlefield innovations. The proximity fuse, guarded as one of the war's most closely held secrets, was introduced into stockpiles. This tiny electronic marvel transformed shells into weapons that could burst in the air above enemy troops, maximizing lethality. For the German defenders, unaware of the scale of this innovation, the results would soon be catastrophic. German intelligence was not blind to the Allied buildup. Reconnaissance flights captured images of ammunition dumps and new encampments across southern England. Reports flowed back to Berlin of an invasion in preparation. Yet, The sheer magnitude of what was coming eluded them. Many Wehrmacht commanders clung to the belief that American artillery, though abundant, was poorly directed and sluggish. The lessons of North Africa and Italy, where American gunners had already proven their growing mastery, were dismissed as exceptions. For American soldiers, the waiting was the hardest part. Letters home spoke of nervous anticipation. "We are ready," one gunner wrote. But every day the weight of what's coming presses harder. Training grounds echoed with the thunder of practice barges, while at night the channel shimmered with fleets of ships assembling for the crossing. To the men preparing to fire the opening rounds, there was no doubt. The invasion would be decided by who could deliver the deadliest storm of fire. As June approached, tension reached its peak. Artillery units stood by their landing craft, guns wrapped and waterproofed, ammunition stacked for immediate use once ashore. Naval gunners aboard cruisers and destroyers cleaned their barrels, awaiting orders to unleash their bombardments. German defenders along the Atlantic Wall dug into bunkers and casemates, peered across the water, convinced they could withstand whatever came. The contrast could not have been sharper. One side, steeped in overconfidence, underestimated the scale of the storm. The other, forged in factories, fields, and training grounds, carried with it an arsenal designed to crush fortresses and silence doubt. On the night of June 5th, as Allied convoys slipped into the channel, the gunners sat ready. Shells were loaded, sights were set, and calculations whispered through the air. The storm was about to break. June 6, 1944. Dawn crept slowly across the English Channel, its first light dimmed by the rolling haze of exhaust and gunpowder. Beneath the pale sky stretched the largest armada in history, more than 5,000 ships bristling with men, tanks, and guns, all converging on the Normandy coast. At precisely 5:30, the silence broke. Allied battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire in unison, their broadsides shaking the sea itself. The sky above the French coastline ignited as shells screamed overhead, each explosion tearing into the German Atlantic Wall. The invasion of Fortress Europe had begun, and artillery was its opening chorus. The bombardment was deafening. Sailors recalled watching the shoreline vanish beneath geysers of earth and smoke, as if the coast itself was being torn apart. On Omaha and Utah beaches, naval guns targeted concrete bunkers, coastal batteries, and entrenched machine gun nests. The Germans, crouched in their fortified positions, clung to the illusion that they could withstand the storm. But hour after hour, American shells clawed at their defenses, collapsing walls and sealing bunkers shut. Behind the horizon, the next wave of artillery prepared to land. Field batteries of the U.S. Army, armed with 105mm howitzers, 155mm long toms, and an arsenal of mortars, came ashore with the infantry. For gunners, it was among the most dangerous tasks of the day. Landing craft doors dropped under heavy fire. Men waded through surf under the crack of rifles and the rattle of machine guns, dragging gun parts, ammunition, and fire control gear across the sand. Some never made it past the tide. Yet by mid-morning, batteries began to form. Crews worked with frantic precision, assembling their weapons even as shells landed nearby. The effect was transformative. Once the first American howitzers were dug into position, they roared to life. Rapid, coordinated fire tore into German strongpoints, suppressing the very machine guns that had held infantry pinned on the beach. One soldier later recalled that the ground shook with every salvo, and the air itself seemed to vibrate. Each round was calculated, timed, and delivered with devastating accuracy. The lessons of North Africa and Italy, where American gunners had honed their craft, were now put into full effect on the greatest battlefield of the war. For German defenders, the experience was nightmarish. What they had once mocked as clumsy American gunnery now proved suffocating. Reports from the 352nd Infantry Division, holding the bluffs above Omaha, described entire positions erased by fire. Machine gun nests that had cut down the first waves of infantry were silenced in minutes. Observation posts disappeared beneath curtain barges. The shellfire was not only physical destruction, it was psychological warfare. Survivors recalled the terror of unending concussions, the earth trembling as if the world itself had turned against them. Meanwhile, Forward observers directed fire in real time. From landing craft, aircraft overhead, and even soldiers on the beaches, coordinates flowed back to artillery units. Fire control centers adjusted trajectories with remarkable speed, shifting barges onto fresh targets. German reinforcements moving toward the beaches were caught in open fields, pounded before they could reach the fight. For every strongpoint that resisted, American gunners concentrated overwhelming firepower until resistance crumbled. By afternoon, the pattern was clear. The infantry advanced not in isolation, but under a moving canopy of artillery fire. At Utah, where landings had gone more smoothly, gunners supported rapid breakthroughs inland. At Omaha, where the cost was steepest, artillery played the decisive role in breaking the deadlock. Once the big guns were operational, they cracked the German grip on the bluffs, opening paths for infantry to surge forward. Eyewitnesses would forever remember the intensity. It was like standing inside a thunderstorm that never stopped, one U.S. officer recalled. German prisoners, stunned and shaken, spoke of the hopelessness of fighting against such overwhelming barges. The psychological impact was as crucial as the physical destruction. The Wehrmacht's earlier contempt had vanished. American artillery had proven itself the king of battle. By nightfall, the beaches of Normandy were scarred landscapes of smoke, craters, and shattered concrete. But they were also firmly in Allied hands. The guns had paved the way, smashing defenses and breaking morale. Normandy was not won in a day, but on that day the decisive role of American artillery had been made clear, a storm of fire that silenced doubt and carved a foothold into Fortress Europe. In the weeks after June 6, 1944, the battle for Normandy settled into a brutal war of attrition. The beaches had been won, but inland, the Allies faced the nightmare of the bocage, a patchwork of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and farm fields that turned every advance into a bloody contest. Here, tanks could not maneuver freely, and infantry was ambushed at every bend. Against these defenses, American artillery emerged not as a supporting arm, but as the decisive weapon that broke the stalemate. German commanders, who had once dismissed U.S. gunners as mechanical and unimaginative, now confronted a force capable of summoning devastation with astonishing speed. Through efficient communication networks and standardized equipment, U.S. artillery could mass fire from dozens, even hundreds, of batteries within minutes. German officers, caught in these storms, wrote with disbelief about barges that seemed to fall from nowhere, leaving no time to react. Among the most feared innovations was the time-on-target technique. In these fire missions, every gun across a sector carefully calculated firing times so that all shells, whether from 105mm howitzers or 155mm long toms, landed simultaneously on the target. The effect was terrifying. One moment, silence. The next, an entire position engulfed in thunder. Survivors often described it as if the sky had collapsed at once. A German soldier later recalled that there was no warning whistle, only fire and earth exploding all around. The power of this system reached its climax in July 1944 during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy. After weeks of grinding combat in the bocage, General Omar Bradley's First Army prepared to punch through the German lines south of St. Lo. On July 25th, a massive aerial bombardment opened the attack, but it was U.S. artillery that sustained the momentum. More than 1,500 guns unleashed rolling barges that pulverized German strongpoints, while forward observers guided fire onto retreating units. The scenes were apocalyptic. Skies filled with choking dust, fields erupted in continuous detonations, and the roar of thousands of shells merged into an unending rumble. Infantrymen advancing behind the barrage described the ground shaking beneath their boots, as if walking through an earthquake. German defenses crumbled under the combined weight of precision and volume. Entire battalions were reduced to fragments, their communications shattered and morale destroyed. Even elite German divisions, such as the Panzerlehr, could not withstand the storm. Their armored vehicles, trapped on roads or caught in open fields, were smashed by concentrated fire. Survivors abandoned equipment and fled, while commanders reported units disintegrating under the relentless bombardment. What the Wehrmacht had once mocked as clumsy had proven capable of engineering tactical collapse on a massive scale. For the Americans, the transformation was profound. Only 2 years earlier, at Kasserine Pass, U.S. artillery had struggled to coordinate under pressure. Now, in Normandy, it was the undisputed king of battle. Coordination between ground forces, forward observers, and artillery batteries was seamless, a testament to both training and industrial might. Millions of shells, stockpiled in Britain before D-Day, ensured that American gunners could maintain their tempo without pause. Personal accounts give life to the scale of destruction. One U.S. gunner recalled firing until his hands blistered from handling hot shells, the gun crew working in rhythm without rest. German prisoners often appeared dazed, unable to comprehend how quickly American barges shifted from one target to another. For many, the psychological collapse mattered more than the physical destruction. Artillery, they realized, left no safe ground. By early August, the effects of Operation Cobra rippled across Normandy. German lines fractured, and Allied forces poured through the breach, advancing rapidly into Brittany and toward Paris. The breakout marked not only the beginning of the end for German forces in France, but also the validation of American artillery as the decisive instrument of victory. The once dismissed amateur gunners had turned into masters of modern firepower. With every salvo, the Wehrmacht's confidence eroded further. Normandy was not merely a triumph of infantry or armor. It was an artillery campaign, where the thunder of American guns broke the back of German resistance and opened the road to liberation. By the summer of 1944, the scorn that German officers had once heaped upon American artillery had been buried beneath fields of craters. What began as derision, mocking U.S. gunners as clumsy and machine-dependent, ended in reluctant respect. In Normandy, the amateurish force had become a storm of steel that ground the Wehrmacht into retreat. Across Europe, U.S. artillery had proven itself not only as a support arm, but as a decisive instrument of strategy. By war's end, American batteries had fired over 40 million shells on the continent, a scale of fire unmatched in history. The numbers alone told the story of industrial might. Factories in Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Chicago had churned out the howitzers, trucks, and munitions that ensured the Allies never lacked for firepower. But it was not production alone that broke German confidence. It was the innovation, precision, and coordination with which the shells were delivered. German commanders admitted as much in post-war interrogations. One officer described American artillery as the most formidable of Allied weapons, recalling how barges seemed to materialize without warning, overwhelming defenses before countermeasures could be organized. Another remarked that while German guns were technically excellent, the Americans had mastered the art of mass fire, combining speed and flexibility with inexhaustible supply. The legacy of Normandy lay in this fusion of industry and tactics. Techniques such as time on target barges, perfected in the bocage, became symbols of American artillery's efficiency, weapons not just of destruction, but of psychological dominance. Survivors spoke of the uncanny silence before impact, followed by the earth itself erupting in a single shattering moment. For German soldiers, it was an enemy they could not outmaneuver. For American troops, it was the shield and hammer that carried them forward. The transformation was striking. In North Africa, U.S. gunners had been inexperienced, often outpaced by German maneuver and precision. In Normandy, they had become the king of battle, their fire missions deciding the course of operations from D-Day to the breakout at St. Lo. What had been underestimated was now undeniable. Artillery was not just a supporting element of infantry and armor, but the central pillar of Allied battlefield supremacy. The landscape itself bore witness. Aerial photographs after Operation Cobra revealed entire swathes of Normandy scarred with overlapping shell craters, villages reduced to rubble, hedgerows flattened into dust. The earth carried the memory of every salvo. Farmers returning after the war found their fields littered with shell fragments, rusting reminders of the storm that had once raged overhead. For the men who fought there, the sound of Normandy was not the clash of rifles or the growl of tanks. It was the unending thunder of American guns. One infantryman later recalled, "It felt like the sky was on our side. Every time we were pinned, the shells came down and cleared the way." The irony was complete. The same German officers who once derided American artillery had watched their divisions collapse under its weight. Their arrogance had been undone not by theory, but by fire and steel. Normandy became the crucible where American gunners silenced all doubt. As the war pressed into Germany, the lesson was clear. In modern land warfare, size of guns mattered less than speed of coordination, depth of supply, and the will to adapt. The United States had turned its industrial base into an arsenal of precision, and its gunners into masters of modern firepower. In closing, the image remains: Normandy's fields, scarred by thousands of craters, stretching to the horizon like the pockmarked face of the earth itself. Each hollow in the soil marked a moment of thunder, a fragment of the storm that broke the Wehrmacht. The final irony lingered. What the Germans once mocked as amateurish had become the weapon that shattered their defenses. The legacy of firepower was written not in boasting, but in silence, the silence that followed when the last guns fell quiet, leaving only the memory of the storm that had reshaped history.